Today's daf we're going to be learning is Menachot daf Samach. Today's daf is sponsored by Rabia and Oliver Mitchell in honor of their daughter, Rachel Mitchell, who is drafting into the IDF today. Today also marks the first anniversary of Rachel making Aliyah. Rachel, you're fulfilling the dreams of your ancestors. Your grandfather heard Jabotinsky speak in Riga, Latvia, and all the members of our family who long for a Jewish homeland are standing with you today in spirit. Although our flights were canceled, we are always with you and are infinitely proud of you. Hashem yishmor tzidcha v'ocha eta v'yarolam. Okay, we are going to get started with Amar of Yitzchak Bar Yosef toward the bottom of yesterday's daf. We're going to see two different versions of what Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef said. In the first version, he quotes Rabbi Yochanan as saying, what we're going to discuss today in the beginning of the daf is this prohibition of lo yasim ala Hashem and v'lo yiten aleha livona. Okay, notice, let's just talk about this phrase for a minute in the pasuk. This is again in the Menachot, the sinner, the sliding scale offering. If you can't afford, you bring a mincha. And it says, don't put shemen, don't put levona. But in English, kind of translate, don't put shemen, don't put levona. But in Hebrew, it's a different word. Lo yasim is to put, and lo yitain is to give. Okay, sort of. That's the way to translate it. But they both really mean don't put, but the Torah uses a different word. Okay, and in addition, we're going to see, it could have just said, lo yitain livona or shemen. Why does it specify don't put livona and don't put shemen, right? Or don't put shemen, don't put livona in two different phrases. Right? We've seen before where it says don't do this and that, and it means there's two separate prohibitions, but yet it's separated here for a really, it seems like no good reason, and we're going to darshan that as well. So the first part is really trying to figure out, what do we learn from this yasim and yitain, and from the word aleha, in terms of how much, what's the requisite amount you need to put on in order to be obligated. We need to know the requisite amount of the oil that you put, the requisite amount of the frankincense that you put, and the size of the mincha that you have to put it on. Does that need a requisite amount? So that's what we're going to discuss the very first part. So Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef says, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the first version, he says in the name of Rabbi Yochanan, Natan mashu shemen al gabe kizayim mincha pasal. Just by putting any amount of oil on, as long as, okay, we need no measure of oil really, no minimum requirement, but we need a minimum requirement of the mincha. The mincha needs to be a kazayit. The oil could be any amount, and then already you disqualify it. And obviously you're obligated, right? You're going to get lashes. My time, well, where do we get this from? Lo yasim, sima kol dehu. Okay, pudding is really, there's no amount, okay? It seems like, why they're saying there's no amount, because there's no known amount. Wherever it says sima in the Torah, there's never a known amount. We'll see when we get to nitina, it's going to be different because there is a set amount that we can learn from one of the psukim about it. But sima, there's never really a specific requisite amount, so it's anything. Aleha adi kashiura. But it says on it must be something of significance, so the mincha has to be at least a kazai. That's the first drashot. Now, Amar Rabbi Yitzchak Bar Yosef, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, the second thing he says is, Natan kezayit levona al gabe mashu mincha pasal. When it comes to levona, everything is flipped. The levona needs to be at least a kezayit, but the mincha can be any amount. Now, this is going to be strange. Maybe you could say we could distinguish between sima and nitina, but aleha appears in both parts of the pasuk. If we just said aleha means a kezayit, how do we get that aleha in the second part of the pasuk doesn't mean a kezayit? So, my taima, so here he'll explain, lo yitain ktiv, adika nitina. It says lo yitain, nitina needs a shi'ur, and therefore it has to be nitina. Before we get to explain this a little better, I'll go on for one more minute. Aleha, so I don't leave you in suspense about what he does with this aleha. Aleha, having me riboy achal riboy, ve'em riboy achal riboy, ela lema'et. Well, the aleha doesn't really need to be mentioned twice, right? There's a lot of things here that don't need to be mentioned twice. You certainly don't need on it. You already said on it. What else would you be putting it on? You could have easily said it without the word aleha appearing twice. When you have a pasuk aleha, which comes to say, well, it needs a bigger shiur, and then you have another pasuk, another word aleha coming to say the same thing. Well, when you have two things, when you have the same word coming to say the same thing in the same pasuk, they actually negate each other. And that's what's called ein riboy achar riboy. If you have some inclusion and then another inclusion, it actually comes to litzamtzem, to make it smaller, which means instead of saying kazayit, well, the first one needs a kazayit, but the second mention of it already comes to say you don't need a kazayit in the mincha. But you do need a kazayit of levona because it says yitain. Rashi quotes a pasuk in Vayikra Kaf Bet. Okay, in Vayikra Kaf Bet, it's talking about a zar not eating kodshim. So if you eat like a truma or something, v'ish ki yochal kodesh b'shkaga, or items that belong to the Kohen, if you eat kodesh b'shkaga, v'yasaf chamishito alav v'natan l'kohen et hakodesh. So it says you have to add an additional fifth, and to return the item, add an additional fifth, and give the Kohen the kodesh. Okay, give him the money. Now, what does Rashi say here? Okay, if you skip down a little to the third line in Rashi, or a second line, Nitina b'kizayit, kidichtiv v'natan l'kohen et hakodesh. Now, how do you know that there's nitina, he gives the kodesh? How do you know that the kodesh needs to have a kizayit? Because in the beginning, what happened? He ate it. Now, eating always requires a requisite amount to be liable for eating. So since the beginning of the verse was talking about eating, and eating is a kazayit, then obviously the nitina is a kazayit. And from there, Rashi explains, that's how they got to this idea that nitina is always kazayit. Why is this interesting? Because Tosfot quotes all these places, as Tosfot is known to do. Right? Rashi is very kind of focused on, okay, this is what's in the daf, this is what it says, this is what we're focusing on. Tosfot looks at the whole picture and says, wait, let's see all sorts of places in the Torah where it says nitina, and the halacha is not a requisite amount, but any amount. Okay, comes up by get. He gives her a get. There's no one ever said the get has to be a requisite size. Okay, so he gives the whole list of all sorts of cases, and each time he has to answer it in some way. Oh, there it says sefer. A sefer could be anything. Or there, right? Each time he has to explain why the nitina there, if the default nitina has to be a certain requisite amount, why it doesn't. So it's just interesting. I want you never to take anything at face value, right? It says, oh, nitina is always a kazayit. Well, know that it's not always a kazayit. Okay, moving on. So we had, it's kind of flip, right? It's easy to remember. Shemen, any amount, but has to be on a kazayit of mincha, and levona has to be a kazayit on any amount of a mincha. Now, we're going to have the second version of what Rav Yitzchak said. Ikeda Amre, Amar Rav Yitzchak Bar Yosef, by Rabbi Yochanan. He says, actually, Rabbi Yochanan had a question about this. And we're going to end with a teku, an unanswered question. Natan mashu shemen al gabe kazayit mincha mahu. If you put a mashu of shemen, any amount of shemen, on a kazayit of a mincha, what is the halacha? He didn't know. Right, we said sima, it's not like we really know whether there's a requisite amount or not. We kind of assumed in the first sugya, there's no requisite amount, because we don't know there is. But he says, well, since sima comes up in the pasuk, juxtaposed to nitina, maybe on sima kinitina, although, does the sima need to be, maybe sima in general isn't, but maybe here it is, because the lavona needs a requisite amount. So maybe the shemen would also, and ends with teku. So a very different sugya here, because here he's not starting with, this is like that and that is like that. The only thing that's clear is the nitinat. The question is about the sima. Okay, now we're going back to the Mishnah. Even though it's quoting the end of the Mishnah, we're actually going back at first. We're going to bring a braita, and it's really coming for the end of the Mishnah, but it's also the first part of the braita relates to the first part of the Mishnah. So let's just remember the Mishnah. Mishnah Nun Tedam Ubet said, you're chayav on shemen b'fnei atzmo and levona b'fnei atzma. You're going to get a separate set of lashes for each. And then at the end of the Mishnah, it talked about putting a vessel with oil on top of the mincha that was in a vessel. Right there, you're not liable for putting oil on it. You're only liable if you actually put the oil on it. So this braita is going to darshan those two things, but a little bit different in the beginning. You'll see. Tanu Rabbanan lo yasima leha shemen v'lo yiten, etc. Yachol b'shnei kohanim. You might have thought that this is only, you're going to be liable for each one separately if two different people do them. Okay? One Kohen put the oil on, one put the frankincense on, then there will be two sets of lashes. But if one individual did it, maybe there's only one set of lashes. And this is partly because it doesn't say, don't put on shemen and levona, but it seems to separate them. So maybe there's a thinking that this one has to be done by one person, this one has to do with the other. That's what Rashi says. Tosfot also here takes issue with Rashi and says, why would you have ever thought that? He thinks the issue is maybe you need two separate menachot. And then why does it say two kohanim? Because chances are, if you're having two different menachot, right, and as if you put shemen and levona on the same one, maybe you wouldn't be liable too. It's if you put shemen on one and levona on a different one, and that's why two kohanim, because each one is a different kohen dealing with it. But that's not the main focus of the people. The focus is two menachot. Maybe then. Okay, so a bit of a question what exactly the original thought was here that they're going to reject. Talmud Lomar, the Braita though says, Aleha. Because it says aleha, what is it clear? Begufa shel mincha kachu b'daber v'lo b'kohen. It says nothing to do with the kohen, okay, which was the literal according to Rashi, like it's all about the person. No, it has nothing to do with the person. It has to do with the mincha itself. Aleha, on the mincha. According to Tosfot, you could say aleha is specifically on the mincha, on one mincha, right? And not necessarily on two different kohanim dealing with two different menachot. But aleha, on it, on the same it as it was in the previous part of the pasuk. And therefore, it's clear that the two prohibitions are actually could be on the same mincha, and you could be liable 2 sets of lashes for ruining the same mincha by putting on both oil and frankincense. So in the end, they get to the halacha we have in our Mishnah. It's just they kind of suggest that maybe there would be something else, and shows from the pasuk where we get it from. Second part of the Braita, which, as I said, relates to the kli al gabei kli. Yacholu yitain kli al gabei kli v'im natan pasal. You might have thought you can't put a vessel with oil on top of the vessel with the mincha in it, and if you did, you disqualified it because it says don't put it on. On means on top, anyway on top, even if it's in a vessel. Talmud lomar aleha. Now, when it says on it, it means literally on it, physically touching it. Begufa shel mincha katuv medaber. It's talking about the mincha itself. It has to be actually on the mincha, not on the vessel that is holding the mincha. Okay. That's the end of the first part of today's daf. The second part of today's daf is going to be very similar in style and in structure and we'll see in content a little different, but similar type of content to yesterday's daf, where we're going to talk now about yesh tu'unot hagasha ve'en tu'unot shnufa. We're now going to have again 4 categories, but not about shemen and levona. The 2 issues we're going to discuss are waving the mincha and bringing it to the altar. There's this halacha, and today's focus is going to be only on hagasha. I'm bringing it to the altar. We're going to start with the category. Okay, it's different. Last category, I just want to remind you of the list last time. There was yes, shemen and levona. There was only, I don't remember which came first, but only shemen, not levona, only levona, not shemen, and then ended with none. Okay, it was a very organized list. Yes, both, one, not the other not the one, and none. This mission is organized in a different order, even though all those 4 permutations are there, which is yes tnufa, yes hagasha, either one, not the other, either the other, not the one, and none, neither. But instead they organize it starting with, there are those that need hagasha and don't need tnufa, so one of the middle ones. Okay, the reason I'm going to start with this is going to be very obvious, because the last Mishnah, yes Shem and yes Levona, the first one, had the long list of the 10, right? The Rav Papa said these are the 10. The 10 were in that first category. So probably they wanted to put the 10 again in the first category here because there's so many in one way, and then we have a little bit in some of the other, just a few in some of the other categories. It's probably why they started this way and not the more intuitive way, which would to be yes tnufa, yes hagasha, and then end with neither. Okay? Today's Mishnah is only going to get to the first category. Yes tu'unot hagasha ve'en tu'unot tnufa. So there are those that need to be, we'll talk in a minute what hagasha is exactly, bring it to the altar. And there are those that don't require waving. Hagasha u'tnufa, some need both. Tnufa v'lo hagasha, not tnufa, not hagasha. And tnufa v'lo hagasha, yes waving, no bringing it to the altar. And lo tnufa v'lo hagasha, and neither. You can see that all they did here was switch the first 2, right? They basically, once they finished with the one that needs one and not the other, then they went to where they would have liked to start, which is both, only one, and neither. Okay, that's just a side point about the order of the Mishnah, which it's just nice to pay attention and see that this is different than the previous. So now we're going to start with our main one, Eila tu'unot hagasha ve'ein tu'unot tnufa, and now we're going to go to our same list as yesterday. Minchat solet, machvat, marcheshet, chalot v'rikikin. Those are the first 5 that are menachot nidava. Minchat kohanim, minchat kohen mashiach, minchat goyim, or nochrim, minchat nashim, uminchat chotei. Now here's the one difference with the previous. The previous one had minchat ha'omer. This one actually has minchat chotei instead of minchat ha'omer. When we get into the Gemara, we're going to get into the big discussion about which one's in, which one's out, how do we know, where do we get it from, all that. Rabbi Shimon comes and disagrees and says, Minchat Kohanim, Minchat Kohen Mashiach, Ein Bahem Hagasha. Okay, these 2, the Minchat Kohen, the Minchat Kohen Mashiach, don't have Hagasha at all. Now, why does he say these 2 are different? Lefisha Ein Bahem Kmitza. V'kol she'ein behem kmitza, ein behem hagasha. He says hagasha goes hand in hand with kmitza. If a korban has kmitza, which is most korbanot, you kometz, you take the kometz, you burn it on the altar, and the rest is the shirayim is eaten by the kohanim. But the mincha kohen and the mincha kohen Mashiach, the mincha chavitin of the kohen gadol, those two are burned completely. There's no kometz. So comes Rabbi Shimon and says, if there's no kometz, there's no hagasha. Okay, these cases we're not going to talk about today. We're going to really get to all the others that are not in this list, and the mincha chote, and why is it yes in the list. Obviously, the 5 are going to be in the list, and you'll see why in a minute. Okay, before we read inside, actually, let's go to Rav Papa, and then we'll read inside. Okay, so Rav Papa says, Amar Rav Papa, same exact sugya as yesterday. Kol hecha ditnan, eser tnan. Whenever they have these lists here, it's always 10. My kamashmalan, what's he coming to teach us? La'afuke midei Rabbi Shimon, de'amar mechza chalot u'mechza rikikin yavi kamashmalan. He's coming to disagree and say, I don't hold like Rabbi Shimon, who says that the half chalot, half rikikim is another type of mincha, and that would add another one to the list. Now, in this case, the previous case, it would have been 11. In this case, Rabbi Shimon takes off 2, but he adds 1, so he would have 9. Okay, and Rav Papa is saying I don't agree with him about specifically the issue of the mechza chalot, mechza rikikim. By the way, now maybe it's a good time to mention, yesterday I didn't mention it, but I don't think I mentioned it, but Rashi has a different interpretation here of what the 10 is. I can't remember now if I said it or not, but I don't think I said what it was. Rashi has this opinion that when he talks about the 10 here, it's not the 10 in the list. It's that each of these menachot, when they're mentioned, this group, all need to be 10 loaves. You need to, just like we have the rikikim and the matzot, where we know it's 10 loaves that you would prepare, with all these others, you would prepare 10 loaves. Which, by the way, is kind of a little shocking because I wanted you to think about this, and then I actually started thinking about it, like, what's the reality of this case in the Minchat Solet? Okay, and then I saw that there were 2 different interpretations of Rashi here on this. So I'll tell you why, and I started thinking, okay, what's the reality? You're going to take the Minchat Solet. If you're going to bake them, I understand. So you make loaves, you bake them before you do the kmitza, and then you do the kmitza. It's still a little weird to do kmitza when you have 10 different loaves, but I guess you just take part of one of them. But in the Minchat Solet, we always describe the process. What do? You put in a kli, then you bring it to the altar, which we're going to talk about soon, which is the hagasha. Then you take a kometz out of there. Now, where are the loaves coming into play? No one ever talked about making loaves out of them. So, but if according to the first reading in Rashi, what he means here is all of them were set in 10 loaves. And by the way, there's a Mishnah that's going to talk about this 10 loaf thing. So, at what stage do you do it? So, some people say, actually, Rashi thinks before you take the kometz, even though we haven't really discussed this, you form 10 loaves. You have 10 balls of dough, basically. And from there, they're all together in the bowl. And then you take a kometz out of there. That's one way of reading Rashi. It's a little strange to think that that's how we do it because we never really discussed it. And it seems a little weird, but that's one way. The benefit of that is the other way is very strange as well. Because if you go the other interpretation, it's after the kmitza, you separate it into 10 loaves. So basically, it's all dough. It's one ball of dough. You take the kometz, you burn it. Well, the rest is shirayim. Like, why would it be so important to take the shirayim and make them into balls, right? We already learned the shirayim. You could even eat them with honey, right? Like, it's not as significant. It's just more what the food the kohanim can eat. So that also seems a little difficult. But you can see that's why there were different interpretations of Rashi. Which one does he go with? And I'm sharing this all with you because when I saw that, I started thinking, what's the reality? And then I saw that there was a bit of a conversation, among the commentaries. What did Rashi mean? Okay, but anyway, it's a total side point. It's just a different interpretation of what this 10 is. I went yesterday with the simpler one because it just seems simpler to explain. Okay, there's 10 on the list, move on. But I thought today I would share it. Okay, Minan and Mile. Now we're going to get into what is the source. Just to share with you, I'm always in deliberation about how much to share. This actually came up in a discussion, a meeting I had with teachers the other day about when you're teaching your students, okay, and they were more like it's high school teachers, how much do you share with them the different opinions, and then we started talking about how, if usually we go with Rashi, but often, like, if you look in, like one of the teachers said, if you look in the Steinsaltz, which is the Koran in English, he doesn't always go with Rashi. And if your students are using that and you teach them one way and then they're using the Steinsaltz, then they're going to say, oh, then they're using that to study with, it's going to be completely confusing. And I find that a lot because I know that of learners, some are using the Shanstein, some are using the Koren or the Sefaria, which has the Koren's interpretation. And sometimes they say something and you could be reading it and saying that's completely wrong. That's not what it says. But sometimes it's just a different interpretation. Sometimes I do make mistakes and it's wrong. But I shared with them, I said, I go through this all the time in my thinking because how much you share and complicate things and how much you keep it simple because it's just easier to keep it simple. But that sometimes causes people to say, what? That's not what it says in my Gemara. So anyway, it's an interesting issue. Okay, let's move on. Now we get to our real drashot of today's daf. So this whole idea of hagasha comes up in chapter 2 of Vayikra, the one we saw yesterday, and it's in yesterday's study guide. If it were not for the warrior, I would have made a study guide for today also, but after last night's sirens 2 nights ago, I was too tired yesterday and this morning also. Too many sirens in the middle of the night. But anyway, so I apologize for not getting a good study guide here because it would have helped a lot. Hopefully I'll organize it enough that you can have it clear in your head where we're going. In chapter 2, verse 8, which is on yesterday's guide, okay, so after it lists the solet, the machva, the ma'afet tanur, the machvat, the marcheshet, the next pasuk is Veheveta et hamincha asher ye'aseh me'ela l'Hashem. Pay close attention. We're going to darshan most of these words. You're going to bring the mincha. Okay, heveta et hamincha. We're going to darshan heveta. We're going to darshan et. We're going to darshan hamincha or hamincha. Asher ye'aseh me'ela. That will be made from these. What are these? The 5 things mentioned before. It's really 4, but ma'afeh is 2 because ma'afeh is rikikim and chalot. Just so you don't get confused because it's solet, ma'afet tanur, baked in the oven, machvat, baked on that griddle pan, and marcheshet, baked in the deep pan. So, but ma'afet tanur is rikikim and chalot, so it counts as 2. So anyway, if you make from one of these, la Hashem, for God, vihi kriva ela kohen, you're going to bring it to the kohen, vihi gisha ela mizbeach, and the kohen is going to bring it to the mizbeach. That's the chiyuv of hagasha. It comes up in that pasuk. Today we're going to darshan that pasuk to many different ways. Okay, and many different parts of that pasuk. So we're going to start with the Tanu Rabbanan Braita. Ilu ne'emal veheveta asher ya'aseh me'ela l'Hashem. You have to figure out which words did he skip here. If it had said, you bring from what you made from these to God, v'hikriva l'kohen v'gishan, you bring it to the kohen and give it to and bring it. Hayiti omeo. I would have thought that what are you supposed to bring? But what words did he delete here? Et hamincha. Okay? Now, obviously we're talking about the mincha because heveta, you bring it. What are you going to bring? Now, what does it say? You're going to bring what you're going to do from these to God. What part of it goes to God? The komets. The rest of it goes to the kohanim. So I would have thought it would have made sense to say it's just the komets gets brought to the mizbech. Mincha minayin, how do we know you actually bring the whole batch of dough, which is what we've been discussing all along? You bring the whole mincha to the altar, and then you do the komets after that. Talmud Lamal, mincha. That's why it repeats the word mincha. Again, it doesn't repeat it in the pasuk, it just repeats it. It was already talking about the mincha, you didn't really need that word. So mincha comes to say you bring the whole thing. So let's just review what this halacha is. This halacha is you're supposed to take the mincha, the dough before kmitza, bring it to the altar. Where do you bring it? Remember, to the southwest corner, because it's El Panam Mizbeach and the Fnei Hashem. It's got both those things. We've talked about this before, depending on where exactly the altar is placed. But that's the way to get both south and west. I'm both facing the altar, which is from the ramp, which is from the south side, and coming out of the Heichal, which is on the west side. The southwest corner, that's where you're going to have the perfect spot. So you bring it to that southwest corner. It's actually supposed to touch the altar as well. You're supposed to touch it to the altar, not the top of the altar. You're at the bottom. Now, so mincha, we learned it's the whole mincha, not just the komets. Now we're going to start with which ones are included, which ones aren't. Minchat chote minayin. So how do we know that minchat chote is on this list? Because that's the one that's the oddball. Because remember, it's not in the previous one. And it's not one of the 5. And it's not the women, which we said anyway, it shouldn't really be different. And the Oved Kochavim also, that's just a regular voluntary offering. And the Kohanim and the Kohen Mashiach are also voluntary offerings. This one's a little different. This is an obligatory offering. How do we know it's included? Talmud Lamal, et hamincha. Okay. Et hamincha includes extra word et, it includes an extra korban, the mincha chote. Now they're going to say, why do I need a pasuk for this? Vidinhu, it should just be made by logical assumption. what's the logic? So what we're going to basically do is go through a whole long logical argument, and in the end, we're going to try to stop it here and there, say, no, you still could, back and forth, till we get to, you can't learn it from logic, that's why we need the pasuk. So they're starting with the pasuk, but then they say, well, you might have thought you could learn it by logic, you don't need a pasuk. You can't. So v'din, and then we're going to do this a few times today, this kind of thing. Ne'emar, turning now to Amud Bet. Ne'emar have minchat chova, v'ne'emar have minchat nedava. Right? There's two types of menachot. One is obligatory, one is voluntary. Ma minchat nedava tu'una hagasha. Well, since we have these two types, and we'll just assume we'll learn one from the other. So minchat nedava needs hagasha, because again, it's the only place really where it's mentioned. So av minchat chova tu'una hagasha. And when it talks about the menachot, again, that's the korban levi orei, the sliding scale offering. It never says you're supposed to bring it to the altar. But you might have thought, okay, well, just like the voluntary, also the obligatory. But they say no, because the minchat nedava has some stringency that the minchat chote doesn't. What is that? From yesterday's sugya. Ma minchat nedava shekain tu'una shemen ulevona. It needs oil and frankincense. And therefore, you could say maybe the minchat chote, which doesn't need oil, doesn't need frankincense, maybe it also doesn't need bringing it to the altar. So they say, no, you can't say that, because minchat sota tochiach. The minchat sota, okay, now, this is going to be circular logic. The minchat sota we're going to learn later needs hagasha. Now, why wasn't it on our list in our Mishnah? Because it needs hagasha and hanafa. Okay, so it's going to appear in a later Mishnah. But it does need hagasha. Remember, I told you today's focus is only on the hagasha. Bring it to the altar, not on the waving. So minchat sota will prove it. Now later we're going to learn how they get minchat sota. So these logics are always confusing because the logic is based on knowing some other drashot, which we haven't gotten to yet. But soon we're going to darshan from our pasuk that minchat sota also needs hagasha. And once we include minchat sota, well, that will prove it. Minchat sota doesn't need shemen, doesn't need levona. So it's obviously not the stringency of shemen and levona that's going to cause us to say, oh, only things that need shemen and levona need hagasha, because the minchat sota doesn't, and yet it still needs hagasha. So they say, yeah, but that's because minchat sota has a different chumrah. Ma'ala minchat sota sheken tu'una tnufa, but that needs waving. So maybe because it needs waving, it also needs bringing to the altar hagasha. But you wouldn't necessarily say the same thing for the minchat chote, which doesn't need waving. So they say, no, because minchat nedava tochiach. What do you mean? This is the classic. This one has a stringency, that one has a stringency, but each one doesn't have the stringency of the other. So those stringencies are canceled out, and what are we left with? The least common denominator. So we have, on the one hand, minchat nedava, we have minchat sota. From the two together, we should be able to learn to minchat chote. Because chazar adin lo rizeh kirizeh v'lo rizeh kirizeh, each of their stringencies got knocked out, because if it was the shemen and levona that required hagasha, then the minchat sota wouldn't need it. And if it was the tnufa that was the issue that caused us to also need hagasha, the waving, well, the minchat nedava doesn't have waving. So, hatzada shaveh shabem, what's the least common denominator? Sheshavula kmitza, what's similar about them? You need to do kmitza. And shavula hagasha, and you need to bring them both to the altar. So, afan yavi minchat chote, well, I'll take the minchat chote, it also needs kmitza. Sheshavelem the kmitza, it's just like them in terms of kmitza. Tishvelehem lagasha. And then we should learn, logic would state, they also need hagasha. And then you wouldn't need a pasuk to prove it. But we do need a pasuk. So what's the problem here? No, because the least common denominator of those two is actually not down at the bottom. There's another least common denominator that's higher up that has a stringency that does not exist by the minchat chote. What is it? A poor person and a rich person bring the exact same sacrifice in all those other ones. Whereas the minchat chote is only brought by a poor person. If you're rich, you don't bring it. So that already has less, right? It's less strong than the others, because the others are very strong. Everybody brings them. And therefore, you could say that maybe hagasha is only by those, and this one maybe doesn't need hagasha. And that's why, right? Tomar b'minchat chote shelo uchshera lavo be'ashir kiva'ani, right? It's not permitted to bring for a rich person like a poor person, and therefore you wouldn't be able to learn it from the other two, and that's why you need the pasuk. That's where I started, right? Tamud lamar et hamincha. So the words et hamincha, okay, just to review what we did so far, the word mincha comes to tell us the whole mincha has to be brought in any korban, whichever korban needs hagasha. And now, and that's just about the way you bring it, most of the other drashot are all going to be which one is in, which one is out. So right now, Menachot is in. How did we prove it? Really not by logic. We tried. We tried to learn it specifically from the Nedava and the Sota. We couldn't, because they both have a least common denominator that's non-existent by the Menachot, which is they're brought, rich people bring the same as the poor, and therefore we don't learn it from there. We learn it from a drasha, et. Et amincha, et comes to include an additional case. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Now we have Rabbi Shimon coming. He says, Veheveta lirabot minchata omer lahagasha. Okay, minchata omer, where are we going to get that minchata omer needs hagasha? Now again, it wasn't in the list because the omer also needs waving. Okay? That's why it's a little confusing, because we didn't bring the whole list of everything that needs hagasha. We brought only what needs hagasha that doesn't need waving. But we're going to see that minchata omer also needs. So why does it need hagasha? Veheveta. V'cheinu omer. Why from the word veheveta? Okay, again, that was in the pasuk. Remember the pasuk? So let's just read it again. Veheveta. It's the first word in the pasuk. Heveta et hamincha. Okay, that's the pasuk about hagasha. Heveta. Where does the heveta have anything to do with the omer? Because what does it say by the omer? V'cheinu omer. Vehevetem et omer v'shiktzurchem ala kohen. You're supposed to bring the omer, the first one that you cut, to the kohen. Okay, the omer is the reshit. It's brought. So this is also brought. The same word is used. That word heveta references omer also needs hagasha. Vihi kriva, continues Rabbi Shimon, and he says vi kriva. The word, when it says he kriva la kohen, before it says vigisha la mizbeach, you have to bring it to the kohen. He kriva la rabot minchat sota la hagasha. Remember we talked about before, the minchat sota was obvious it needs hagasha, but we didn't know where it was from. Now we see the drasha. He kriva, you bring, right, the word. Now, where do we get sota has anything to do with hikriva? V'cheinu omer v'kriv ota el mizbeach. The sota has to be brought to the mizbeach using the same word hikriv. We say, from there we learn hikriva. Okay, sota's in. So we basically took two words. We took heveta. We said that references the omer. Hikriva references sota. And that's how we know those two both need hagasha. Again, they're not on our list because they also need waving, and that's going to be in the next mission. Vidinhu. Now they're going to say, wait, but we could have learned it from logic. And then they're going to do the same thing as before. Okay, they're going to try to learn the minchat sota from logic, and then say in the end, you can't learn it from logic, that's why you needed the pasuk. Vidinhu. Ma minchat chote she'ena tuna tnufa tuna hagasha. Okay, now this is circular. Before we tried to learn minchat chote from the sota logically. Now, assuming we know the minchat chote is in because of our drasha, we're now going to try to learn the minchat sota from the minchat chote. Okay, it's the exact reverse of what we did before. Just remember, these are all premised on that one is learned by drasha. Once one's learned by drasha, you can learn logically to the other. So if a minchat chote doesn't need ena tu'una tnufa, it doesn't need waving, and yet tu'una hagasha, and yet it needs bringing to the altar, wouldn't you just obviously say minchat sote shetu'una tnufa? If the minchat sote needs waving, eno din shetu'una hagasha. If it already needs something additional that the minchat chote didn't need, wouldn't you think it also needs hagasha? So they're saying no, because mala minchat chotesh came ba'achitim, but the minchat chote has something more stringent than the minchat sota. What is that? It comes from wheat. Remember, the minchat sota comes from barley. Barley's not, it's much less. Barley's usually animal food. Okay, so therefore it has stringency, and therefore maybe that one needs hagasha, but not the other. But they say minchat omer tochiach. Now, once you have minchat omer in by the other drasha, so take minchat omer, take minchat sota. Well, minchat omer minchat chote knocks out the minchat chote, because the minchat omer also comes from barley, and yet it needs hagasha. They say, no, because mala minchat omer, it's got its own chumrah. Shekein tu'una shemen u'levona. But that needs shemen and levona, whereas the minchat chote and minchat sota don't. So, minchat chote tochiach, but right, you're going to say, well, the minchat omer, yes, it's barley, so it's like the sota, but it's not really like the sota, because the sota doesn't have shemen and levona, and that's the stringency about an omer, which makes it, and not that. But wait, but the minchat chote knocks that out, because in the end, the minchat chote doesn't need shemen and levona. And again, the minchat omer knocked out the minchat chote's chumrah of chitim, of wheat, because that comes barley. So we're back to both chumras are neutralized. Lo rizeh kirizeh v'lo rizeh kirizeh. That one doesn't look like that. Where that one doesn't have the same stringency as that one. So clearly, the stringencies that we found are not the ones that are causing a hagasha. So let's go to the least common denominator. Hatzada shevesh behen sheshavu l'kmitza v'shavu l'hagasha. Again, we're going to say the same least common denominator. We're always going to go back to this. It needs kmitza and it needs hagasha. So let's go. Afani avi minchat sota sheshavta lem lekmitza. Since we know the sota needs kmitza, it's like the others that need kmitza. And since the ones that need kmitza need hagasha, tishveh lem hagasha, we should say it needs hagasha also. But just like before, we're going to say, remember, all the minchas have to be solet. That means in the last sifting, you put in a sifter, all the powder comes out the bottom, and you're left with the granules of more like sand kind of texture, rather than powdery flour like we use. Okay, so none of the minchas are allowed to come as kemach. That's considered a bad thing, the powdery stuff. But it's called in the Torah kemach se'orim, which means it could be kemach. So it's obviously a lower level, which means it doesn't need hagasha maybe. Okay, you can't learn from logic that it would need because it doesn't need to be solet, so maybe it doesn't need hagasha. Talmud Lomar, that's why Rabbi Shimon had this drashot, vihi kriva, and from there we learn to the sota. Okay, now we're going to have Rabbi Yehuda. He's going to disagree with Rabbi Shimon about a few things. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, veheveta, lerabot minchat sota lahagasha. He agrees that the minchat sota needs hagasha, but he disagrees about where we learned it from. He said it's learned from veheveta and not from vehikriva. Okay, because by the sota it also says v'chenu omer vehevi et korbana aleha. Okay, now what's the problem? Okay, for this you need the chart to be able to look back easily. So imagine a chart. Veheveta, we said before that according to Rabbi Shimon, that brings the omer, vehevetem et omer, right? Reshik tzirchem. So where's Rabbi Yehuda going to learn omer if he uses veheveta for the sota? Aval minchat omer lo tzricha kra. This is the one time we're going to have a logical argument that is going to stand. He says you don't need a pasuk for omer because you could learn it by logic. What's his logic? My time, ma midina ka'atya. You could learn it by logic. Uma minchat chotei she'ena te'una tnufa te'una hagasha. Now, the minchat omer is waived. So if the minchat chotei doesn't need to be waived and needs to be hagasha brought to the altar, minchat omer she'te'una tnufa ein odin she'te'una hagasha. So wouldn't you think then if the omer needs to be waived, it would also need hagasha? But they're going to say no, because what's the stringency in the minchat chotei over the minchat omer? By the way, I did say we're going to have a logical argument, but that won't be knocked out, but I didn't mention that we're going to try to knock it out along the way. Okay, so we will get to a similar type thing here. Ma lemincha chotesh came ba'achitin. Oh, but wait, the minchat omer is barley. The mincha chotesh is wheat. So you can't learn from the wheat case to the barley case. Minchat sota tochiach. So now we're going to try to learn the omer. Okay, we're doing all the possibilities, right? We're going to do the omer from the chote and the sota. Okay, so let's see if we write this one. We are going to succeed. Okay, so minchat sota tochiach. Right, so now it's not going to prove it just yet because the minchat sota is going to say, oh, that's barley and it needs hagasha. Ma the minchat sotesh came ba levarer avon. Now we get to a new chumrah about the minchat sota. The minchat, because we can't say, oh, it doesn't have shemen and levona, because, right? Or, oh no, that was the other one. Okay, forget. But the minchat sota, what's unique about it? It comes to establish, did the woman sin or not? That's very unique. Nothing has that. Even the minchat chote, which is for a sin, is coming to atone for a sin. The minchat sota is to figure out, is the woman guilty or not guilty? So that's a special chumrah. Dimas keret avoni. Okay, some people have those words, some people take them out, but that's what the pasuk says about it. Now, mincha chote tochiach, but the mincha chote doesn't have that, so therefore that's not the element that's causing the hagasha. So we're back to the least common denominator. V'chazar adin lo rizeh kirizeh v'lo rizeh kirizeh hatzad shabesh ben shkin shavu l'kmitza v'shavu l'hagasha af ani avi minchat ha'omer sheshavta lem l'kmitza tishveh lem l'hagasha. So now Rabbi Yehuda is going to end where the others tried to end but didn't because we rejected it. Rabbi Yehuda is going to say in the end, it's true that the mincha chote is wheat and not barley, but the minchat sota is barley and still needs it, so that's rejected. It's true the minchat sota is miskeret avon, but the minchat chote is mivareret avon, figures out whether she's sinning or not. And the minchat chote isn't though. So, and yet both need hagasha. So they each knock out each of the chumras of the other, the least common denominator. They need kmitza, and therefore they also need hagasha. So let's take the minchat omer, which needs kmitza, because you don't burn the whole thing, and therefore it must need hagasha. And that's where we're at right now. That's Rabbi Yehuda. And that's why he learns it by logic. But what do we have to figure out? Why did Rabbi Shimon learn it from the word veheveta? Right, which remember, heveta Rabbi Yehuda used for the sota. But Rabbi Shimon used it for the Omer. Why? So now if the Gemara is going to ask, my parachta. So what did he question? What was wrong with this kavachom, or this logical argument, according to him? Rabbi Shimon parachachi. He didn't like them because malat tzad behen shekem mitzuyin. Says the Menachot and the Menachot, when do you bring them? When you sin. People sin often. They happen multiple times a year. But the mincha of the Omer, no matter what happens in a year, comes once a year only. So those have a stringency that they come much more frequently. Okay, now this is a little strange because you might remember when we learned sota, it was a long time ago, but we discussed very often, it's very likely no one ever was really a sota and brought the mincha sota. It was unclear whether historically it ever happened, certainly unlikely it happened every year. So Rabbi Yehuda is going to say, and why doesn't he go with this logic? Because Rabbi Yehuda Adar says the reverse. Hametzu Yatfei, the Omer is much more common because it happens every single year. Hanach Zimni de lo mishkacha laklal. We don't know how many people had to bring Olav Yoreh Korbanot and how many people brought Sota Korbanot. There could be years where it never happens at all. So, basically we have this disagreement. It's a very interesting disagreement. Was it very common that people brought these sin offerings, or was it incredibly uncommon? Okay, if it's very common, then they have a stringency, and then you can't learn it from logic to the Mincha Omer. If they don't, then you can learn it by logic. Okay, so that's where we end this back and forth with Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Shimon about whether the Omer could be learned by logic or the Omer is learned from Veheveta, which again, Rabbi Yehuda used Veheveta for the Sota because he didn't need it for the Omer. That's how we got here. Okay, now they're going to say, O Eino Ela Omer Veheveta. Now they're going to say Veheveta either which way. Rabbi Shimon darshaned it for the Omer, Rabbi Yehuda darshaned it for the Sota. But maybe Veheveta is coming for something else. And what we're going to do here is say maybe Veheveta is coming for something else. And then we're going to say, no, it's not. There's another word in the pasuk which excludes that possibility, which leaves it open for the drashot of either Rabbi Yehuda or Rabbi Shimon. Oh, I know, Omer veheveta, ela sheyachid mitnadev u'meriv mincha acheret chutz me'ela shebayinyan. Maybe you would think that a yachid who is mitnadev can bring from some other thing, like from barley, even though right until now we were talking about all the voluntary offerings are offered as wheat, but maybe it can be brought from barley. Vidinu, and it would be logical. Hence the word veheveta is including something. So maybe it's not including the Omer, it's not including the Sota, maybe it's including anything you want to bring a voluntary offering from, you can bring. I mean, barley, something else. Vidinu, what would be logic why you would bring it from barley? Tzibor mevi mincha min achitim chova, mevi mincha min asolim chova. So the tzibor has some that are obligatory that are wheat, and some that are obligatory that are barley, which is the Omer, right? All the other ones are not barley. Af yachim mevi mincha min achitim nidava. Yavi mincha min asolim nidava. So just like an individual can bring the mincha from the grains, as a chova, maybe they can also bring the mincha from the sorim as a nadava. They bring grains, right? The wheat can be used as a nadava, so maybe they can also bring the barley as a nadava. Just like in the tzibur and the chova, you have both. Maybe in the individual, you could have nadava of both. Talmud Lomar, and that's what Veheveta would be teaching you. Talmud Lomar, Eile. No, it says Eile. These, meaning only these types. Okay, that was the pasuk, right? It said me'ela. It said me'ela la Hashem. Okay, so ele, only ela, ela. So now they say, what do you mean? Ele, oeno ela mer ela. Why are you assuming ela means that? Maybe ela means something else. Ela lomar hare ela mincha shemevicha mishtan. Maybe it means bring all of these. If you say hare ela mincha, maybe you have to bring the marcheshet, the machvad, that you have to do all the types that we mentioned. That would be a little extreme, but maybe Talmud Lomar, they say no. Eila doesn't come to say you have to bring all of them. Eila, because it says me'ela. Me'ela is always limiting. Okay, so it's true, it says eila. So eila we can explain means only wheat, like this. Me'ela comes to tell you, don't think that eila means you have to bring all 5. No, you can only bring 1. In fact, they say you could bring all 5. But ratzah echat mevi, ratzah chamisha mevi. If you want to bring all 5, you can, but you don't have to. Rabbi Shimon Omer. Okay, now that was all a suggestion. Maybe Heveta is used for something else. We rejected it because of the Eila, and then Eila must mean that and not something else because of the Me'ela. Okay, now, Rabbi Shimon Omer, we're back to Et HaMincha from the beginning. What did we learn from Et? The Minchat Chote, right? So now they're going to say, Et HaMincha, L'rabot sha'ar menachot. It's not just including the Menachot, it's including the Menachot and the Minchat Nashim and the Minchat of De Kochavim. Okay, it's including all those. La hagasha. So now they say, well, if it's an inclusive word that's including a lot of things, if it was just including the Menachot like before, we'd understand one thing. But once including all these things, why don't we include more things? Like, for example, Yachol shani marbe af shtei alechem v'lechem apanim, which don't need hagasha. Why not? Talmud lamar me'ele. So again, the word me'ele is a limiting word. Not all of them, only things that are like this. So mara'ita l'rabot shar menachot u'lotzi shtei alechem v'lechem apanim. Okay, why those are in and those are out? The classic question. Marban yishar menachot sheyesh mehem li'ishim. Because the other menachot, what's similar to them about that in the Minchat Nedava where it needs hagasha? Because the Minchat Chote and the Minchat Nashim and the Minchat of De Kochavim, they're all burned part of it. Or the Minchat Kohanim and Minchat Kohen Gadol are burned completely. As opposed to the Shtei Alechem and the Lechem Apanim where none of it gets burned. Remember, they get completely in by the Kohanim, so they're on the outs because they're different. Now they say, right, they don't go to the fire, so because of that, they're out. So now they say, well, if you're going to include the ones that are on the fire, then why don't you include another one, which again, we didn't see the full list yet. But, now the minchat that goes with the korbanot, that one is completely burned, and yet it's not on this list. Why not? If you just said what determines what's in and what's out is burning, why is that not on the list? Talmud lomar vihi kriva. The word vihi kriva is you sacrifice it. That's again another word in the pasuk. Kriva lakohen. Just this, not something else. So that's limiting. What's it limiting? The minchat nesachim. So first the Gemara is going to ask, first question number one is hafikte. We already used hikriv, remember? Either hikriva we used either to exclude the, to Rabbi Shimon it was to exclude the sota, right? Hikriva. And this is Rabbi Shimon also. So, because this is Rabbi Shimon says, et ha-mincha l'rabot shar menachot. So he already used hikriva for the sota. So how could he use hikriva for this? Hikriva. Because he's focusing on the hikriva. Hikriva is hikrivota. This one, not the other. The other part was talking about the word hikriv, which we learned from the sota. So that's how you can learn both. Last question, which we'll leave as a question. We'll answer it tomorrow in tomorrow's daf. Right? Again, it seems a little arbitrary. Why is minchat, if minchat nesachim is the one excluded, why is that the one excluded and not some of the other ones? So you'll have to wait till tomorrow to get the answer. So what did we do today? We started with the riboy achar riboy and the whole, right, the how much of a shear do you need for the mincha and for the shemen and the lavona, and we had the two different readings of that. Then we got to the list of, we then went back to this Braita that showed us the source for two of the halachas in the previous Mishnah. Then we got to the list of what needs hagasha, and basically in summary, we had different opinions about how to darshan different parts of the pasuk to include which ones are in and which ones are out. And each time we tried to say, maybe there's logic, no, you need the pasuk, except for one where you had actually learned it from a pasuk, which was the Minchat, from logic, which was the Minchat Omer. Rabbi Shimon disagreed with his logic and brought his own. And anyway, there was a whole back and forth there. In the end, we included, just to review a little, we include the Omer, we include the Sota, we include the Minchat Chote, and the logical drashot were all based on, once we assume one's in, right, maybe we could learn from some of the others. But in the end, we couldn't, for the most part. With that, we finish for today. Wishing everyone a good day, safe and a quiet day.